Who watched the coronation?
Our household remains a very strict Republican household.
Fair.
Yeah, like we fought a revolution so that we wouldn't have to get up and watch coronations.
Sure did. We should probably get started, guys.
Are we sure? We sure we want to talk about the court?
I mean, the coronation is more uplifting and the costumes are better.
Yeah.
There's like the Supreme Court does have kind of a dour, down market look.
Should the Supreme Court have wigs?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm very pro-wig.
I'd like to bring Wigs and Supremes together and actually talk about the Supremes, one of the greatest bands ever to exist.
Wait, that's not what we're talking about today?
Oh, Carlos!
God, I've got to change everything.
From New York Times Opinion, I'm Michelle Cottle.
I'm Ross Douthat.
I'm Carlos Lozada.
And I'm Lydia Polgreen. And this is Matter of Opinion.
So today is our first episode, and we're talking about Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice. A slew of stories have revealed that he and his wife have received many gifts, many gifts, from a rich pal who also happens to be a big donor to conservative causes and candidates. And by gifts, I don't mean nice baseball tickets or a holiday cheese basket. We're looking at Kardashian-level lux here. Can someone just recap what's been happening for the last month or so? Carlos?
So we're talking about the court today, thanks largely to the folks at ProPublica, who over the past month have reported several big stories surrounding Clarence Thomas. We've learned a few things. First, that over the past 20 years, Clarence Thomas took some really nice luxury vacations paid by billionaire Harlan Crow. Fancy yachts, private resorts, overseas travel, private jets, that kind of thing. Thomas said he didn't think he had to disclose this kind of personal hospitality, quote unquote, on his financial disclosure forms. We've learned that Harlan Crow purchased property from Clarence Thomas. In fact, he purchased the house that Thomas's mother reportedly still lives in. We've learned that Crow, for some period of time, paid for the private school tuition of Clarence Thomas's grandnephew. So at very least, Harlan Crow is a pretty generous friend. And Justice Thomas did not sufficiently disclose or acknowledge this generosity. And of course, even before all this, public trust in the court was headed in the wrong direction, particularly in the aftermath of the leak of the Dobbs opinion overturning Roe v. Wade. So some of the questions for us: how serious is all this for Clarence Thomas? Where does it rate on the kind of no big deal to hyperventilating outrage meter? What should be done about it, if anything? And I think really more important is, what does it do to the perceived legitimacy of an institution where already you have unelected justices enjoying lifetime terms? So, who wants to go first?
I would just add a couple of things. There is a kind of an area of penumbra around some of the other justices and questions about their activities as well. There was a insider story about the wife of Chief Justice John Roberts making $10 million over many years as a legal recruiter. That feels like a slightly different area of ethical questions. There was also some questions about Neil Gorsuch and a piece of property that he sold. He was part of a group that sold it to the CEO of a law firm. So, and the other thing that's worth saying is that I think that there have also been questions about just generally justices over many years taking these junkets, getting big book advances. I think those are, again, very different from the Thomas situation, but I think they're worth keeping in mind just as we talk about who are these people, what kind of power do they have, and how do you hold them accountable, and are they doing a good job of holding themselves accountable?
So, I mean, one thing to be said is that Harlan Crow may be the greatest name for an American billionaire that you could possibly. I mean, I should say, there are other right of center pundits who have been entertained at Crow's mansion or encountered him in various ways. I have, as far as I know, no connections to Harlan Crow.
Excellent disclosure.
I can disclose I have never gone on vacation with Harlan Crow.
It seems like poor picking of friends, though, Ross.
But you mean he should have taken me?
No, you should have made different choices.
I should have made. Oh well, that's I've known that for a long time. But I'm just saying, this opinion is not bought and paid for when I say that. If I were writing a old-fashioned, pulpy 600-page novel about American politics and I were inventing a conservative billionaire, I would name him Harlan Crow. So I think that's an important framework for the discussion.
That's what really matters here.
I think it's a sort of curious kind of scandal where most people, including most sensible people on the right of center, agree that there is something unseemly about the scale of sort of undisclosed largesse involved in the Crow-Thomas relationship. At the same time, there's no actual quo alleged in any of this quid. It's sort of 50% of a really big deal Supreme Court scandal where people keep looking for the case where Thomas, has cast aside judicial ethics, and nobody seems to have an example of that. So it's more, as far as I can tell, a story about unseemliness rather than actual alleged corruption.
Yeah, but let's jump in right here and stipulate that that is very rarely what you're looking at in these situations. And with Thomas in particular, it seems to be an accretion of perceived conflicts, including dealing with his wife, Jenny, who is this kind of on-fire conservative activist who hobnobs with, groups and people who have business before the court. But that said, I think it is important that we note that this is a nonpartisan, broadly spread, going back decades sort of problem. The entire court needs some guardrails, clearly, because these folks have confused their job of interpreting the law with being above the law.
Well, I think that's right. And I think being a true believer and not actually basing your opinions on this, I think doesn't give you a pass. Ethics exist for a reason, not just to prevent you from doing the wrong thing, but to prevent you from even appearing to have done the wrong thing. And the appearance of impropriety, I think, is just as important as the actuality of impropriety, because sometimes it's hard to know the difference. That, of course, is completely separate whether anything can actually be done about it. And to me, that's the bigger problem that we have, is that we are living in a country that is so deeply divided and polarized, with institutions that are meant to check and balance one another that are just fundamentally broken. And so there just is really no way to hold anything or anybody to account in this situation.
So Senator Durbin, the Democrat who chairs the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, has invited Chief Justice Roberts to testify. And Roberts' response was to say how unusual it is for Chief Justices to appear before the Senate. And he cited a few cases in which it had been sort of like for very kind of low stakes reasons, as if kind of the higher the stakes, the less accountability there should be. Then they released this very generic statement on ethics principles and practices, this very non-binding, surely we all agree that we're going to do the right thing. The lower court judges, to the contrary, are held to this thing called the Guidelines of the Judicial Conference of the United States, which is binding on them, but not binding on the high court. And I think that gets to Lydia's question of, how do we do this when there's no real mechanism in place to set sort of stricter guidelines for the justices, and when the long-term understanding has been that they kind of do it themselves? Even recusal rules, when they decide to recuse themselves, is totally up to each individual justice.
Which, again, has been a problem with Jenny Thomas, Clarence's wife, because of her known role in perhaps trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And then the Supreme Court has to rule on a lot of these cases. This is a clear issue where a little recusal could have come in handy. But nope. Everybody on the court is so convinced of their immaculate conscience that they can't be bothered with such matters.
Well, I mean, this is where the fundamental challenge is that the powers of the court are such that the ideological stakes involved in all decision-making are extremely high. And so the justice who basically makes himself or herself a sort of hyper-pure recusist then ends up in the position of performing a kind of perpetual self-sabotage on their own side in American politics. And of course, there's the view that the justices don't actually take sides and so on, and that they are not supposed to be political actors, right? But everyone knows that that's transparent nonsense. And one of the nice things, I suppose, about the last 10 years is that liberals who used to claim to believe this no longer say that they do, because they no longer control the court.
So the fun's been ruined for everyone. Everyone's unhappy.
Everyone can now at last agree, but it does sort of create permanent problems. And I mean, there are conservatives who have their own long lists of complaints about liberal justices not recusing. But the general issue of you're not recusing enough has been sort of a resilient conversation on the court for a long time, or around the court, at least. The other issue that's worth raising here, which is sort of an odd way of looking at this, is that there are ways in which I suspect that possibly all of the Supreme Court justices regard some kind of compensation-related gray area, the kind of book deals and junkets and everything else, as, in a way, they're due for taking a kind of permanent pay cut to serve on this august body. No, I'm not defending this view. I'm just trying to, at a human level, if you're a Supreme Court justice, you make a really, really nice salary, but you're not rich. You're not making the kind of money that your peers in corporate law firms, the people arguing cases before the court, are making. You exist, especially nowadays, in this bubble of anxiety and threats and security issues. And I strongly suspect that there's a psychological mechanism where a lot of justices, again, not just Thomas, say, this is actually kind of hard service and I'm not being adequately compensated for it.
Anybody who's not working on Wall Street can make that justification. And Brett Kavanaugh, we all know, came out of the womb longing to be a Supreme Court justice. So you should be willing to trade a little bit of financial compensation, and you don't get to travel on private jets all the time like your corporate law friends, to be one of the most powerful people in the country.
I have to say, I think that I, for one, would sign up for paying Supreme Court justices a whole lot more money. They are public servants who do a very important job. And, why shouldn't they be paid, $500,000 or heck, even $1 million? It's only 9 people. We can afford it. I think it's not a terrible idea at all to compensate them and perhaps provide them with other benefits. Problems that can be solved with money are actually the easiest problems to solve in some ways. Just to pick up on what Ross was saying on the recusal question, I'm the farthest thing from an originalist. In fact, I have no judicial philosophy at all. But, since I'm neither a lawyer nor a judge. But it is kind of crazy to think that when the Supreme Court was created, all of these questions about how long someone was going to live, how frequently openings would come up, and all those kinds of things, I think just felt extremely different. We've just been through an extraordinary series of events that resulted in a highly unusual, to use a neutral term, or one might say highly aberrant, to use a perhaps more accurate term, president who served for a single term after not winning the popular vote, but winning the Electoral College, was able to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. That's wild. When we think about the makeup of the court, when we think about the ethics of the court, when we think about all of these things, I feel as if all of the questions are unnecessarily heightened by this very strange and historically rooted, but perhaps not appropriate way that the Supreme Court is made up.
Well, now you're talking about bigger structural changes, which people are also toying with, like either adding members to the court, which I think is very problematic, but the question of term limits has also come up, which would address what you're talking about with the kind of randomness and how they wind up there and who gets to appoint what.
Term limits could also have an impact on what Ross is talking about. The downside of a lifetime appointment is that you never get the chance to then go make your pile of money,
Ooh.
The way it happens in so many other aspects of government, for better or for worse. And if justices knew that this was a 15-year hitch or something like that, then they may not feel the urge to try to cash in while they're in office.
It creates all of these other problems. Imagine if a huge law firm had of counsel former Chief Justice John Roberts on their letterhead, and they're arguing before the court. Things get very tricky very quickly. So I think it's a little bit harder to manage the problem in that way.
It's always a cost-benefit analysis of these things, though, and there are going to be all kinds of unintended consequences. But I do think it's worth looking at the impact it would have on how the nominations take on this incredible intensity. It's a lifetime appointment. You got to get the young judge who's ideologically in tune, and everything is riding on it. Whereas if you have, say, an 18-year appointment, you kind of rotate who's coming on and off, and you know when these things are likely to happen, and you don't have to do things like Mitch McConnell felt he needed to do, which is, somebody dies and you got to hold a seat open for a year until the next election. I mean, there are a lot of benefits to regularizing, so to speak, the way the court evolves. Let's take a quick break. When we're back, is there any way for the justices not to be partisan? And should that even be a goal?
Ross, you raised the issue of how you felt that across the political spectrum, folks kind of understand that the justices are political actors. I wonder if the justices themselves understand that or realize that that is what they are, or certainly how they are perceived. I'm remembering in one of her speeches as a new justice, Amy Coney Barrett said that my goal today is to convince you that this court is not comprised of a bunch of partisan hacks. Of course, what was interesting about it is she delivered that speech at the University of Louisville's McConnell Center. So there was a partisan element even to her presence there. But to the extent that they think of themselves purely as conveyors of a judicial philosophy, as opposed to partisan players, then I think there's going to continue to be the sort of reluctance to hold themselves to similar guidelines as we try to create in the rest of the political system, because they think they're sort of this separate priesthood, this group set apart with their 9 robes. And I think they're the only ones who don't realize or don't admit that they're just as susceptible to all the same political impulses as anyone else serving in government.
Right. I mean, there's a couple ways you could qualify it, right? And sort of understand where the justices who feel, as you described, Carlos, are coming from, right? And one is that, the Supreme Court does a lot of work that is not headline material, that is not cases about hot button culture war issues, Bush v. Gore, contested elections, and so on. And if you're a Supreme Court justice, you spend a lot of time doing that kind of work that doesn't have strong partisan valence. And so that, I think, psychologically creates this strong disposition to think, look, almost all of the time, the work I'm doing is a kind of, to the justice's mind, umpire-based, calling balls and strikes, following arguments where they lead kind of work. And so it's sort of natural to think, well, why can't the country see that that's most of what we're doing? Why is there this fixation on the few cases where inevitably the justices seem to line up along partisan lines? It's like, why don't they get that they're political? Well, lots of their work isn't political. It's just the most important stuff that is.
I think that, in some ways, some of the most celebrated justices were quite political. I mean, Sandra Day O'Connor, who really controlled the court for a very long time as the kind of moderate swing vote and the person that everyone wanted to win over, had a really uncanny sense for where the majority of Americans were and not getting too far beyond that. Her role in Casey, for example, and her sort of personal disgust at the idea that a woman would be required to inform her husband that she was planning to get an abortion. I mean, that just really rubbed her the wrong way. And I think she was onto something. And so I think that really effective judges who have helped moderate and keep the court within a certain kind of band of public approval have had a sense of politics and in many cases have been politicians, which, of course, quite famously, Sandra Day O'Connor was.
And it wasn't just Sandra Day O'Connor. I mean, like Earl Warren was a 3-term governor of California, a Republican. Hugo Black was a U.S. senator. Political experience may be actually quite useful in the court, but there's a difference between being political, being ideological, and being partisan, right? And I think you can parse that out among members of the court today, just as a matter of opinion.
Everyone drink.
Alito may be more ideological than Kavanaugh, but Kavanaugh, I think, seems more partisan than Alito. You can sort of look at these different influences. You mentioned Bush v. Gore, Ross. I mean, 3 of the justices worked on the Bush side of Bush v. Gore. Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Roberts, 3 of the current justices. I mean, that's a remarkable indicator of not necessarily the ideology of the court, but of the partisanship of the court.
So, Ross, looking at your point about kind of why people wouldn't understand the non-political aspects of this, doesn't that kind of push the idea that it would be useful for the court to have some kind of standards whereby, say, they don't speak before highly partisan groups? And I would argue that you could extend that to their spouses as well. But if they want to be seen as above politics, then there really does need to be some understanding of how their more political activities and their spouses' political activities just destroy that. I mean, if they don't want Congress mucking around over there, they probably need to tackle this a little better themselves.
Maybe, but I honestly, you guys can disagree, but most of the people who are most exercised by Clarence Thomas's friendship with Harlan Crow are fundamentally upset that Clarence Thomas is writing conservative opinions on guns and abortion. And the big issues over the court are all about how much power should the court have? How much should it be involved as an arbiter of culture war issues, especially? And if you want the court to sort of not be perceived as political, I think you're much better off, not that this is easy either, but looking at how can we restructure, do term limits. I mean, that's politically impossible for other reasons, but it at least addresses itself to the fundamental question, which is about the court's power in politics.
Talking about conflicts of interests and things that are adjacent to corruption, we've seen a great flowering of investigative reporting around the justices themselves, which has not historically been the case. And I think what has been historically the case is very chummy relationships between the journalists who cover the court, who themselves form a kind of priesthood, right? I mean, they're often highly trained lawyers who geek out on the work of the court. And those skills, I think, are very appropriate to interpreting and understanding rulings. But I think that, the cult around the notorious RBG and it was a little bit unseemly, right? And these are powerful government officials who, as journalists, we should be scrutinizing them and holding them to account. And reading about journalist Nina Totenberg's close relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her friendship with Antonin Scalia, which was those kinds of things I think are a problem. The other thing that I was going to say is just coming back to Thomas. This gets to the point that Ross was making about the kind of political questions in nature here. It's very easy to forget just how isolated Thomas was and how far out of step with the rest of the court Thomas was really, really recently. In his book about the justices, Jeffrey Toobin, was published in 2007. You just get this sense of Thomas as being very, very much on the outside and being a total loner in terms of the work that he did. And apparently he would make his clerks watch the 1949 film version of The Fountainhead, the Ayn Rand novel.
Oh, that's not weird.
As a way to sort of prepare them for the kind of isolation that they were going to experience and the lonely work. But also, in 1997 on the Brady case, which was, quite famously the press secretary of Ronald Reagan, who was injured in a shooting. There was a bill that was like really sort of substantive gun control. And part of the Brady bill was struck down. And in a concurring opinion, Thomas said, actually, the Second Amendment right is a personal right. And, he went so much further than anybody else on the court wanted to go. And it's just really striking the extent to which, that is now the position of the court. And it has not been that long. I mean, this is just a real, real revolution. And so when we talk about, the ways in which things have changed and, sort of who was political and who wasn't political, it is really striking the extent to which the court has moved to Thomas.
In his contribution to Dobbs, where he says that the logic of Dobbs can be applied to other decisions involving same-sex marriage, use of contraceptives, he cites himself 21 times because he really had not much else to cite in support of his views. But you can see how quickly that shifts and what seems fringe becomes more mainstream.
I think from the perspective of most conservatives, and I don't mean sort of the most fringe conservative legal scholars, I think Thomas is taken very seriously and has a indeed extreme, but also extremely consistent and rigorous judicial philosophy. And one of the core questions hanging over all of these controversies is, to what extent is serious intellectual work desirable in a justice? Because Thomas is, whatever else you may think him, Thomas is a more serious theorist and scholar of the law than Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts. And maybe the arguments that people make are fundamentally that that's bad, and that the court should be the province of a kind of, Sandra Day O'Connor, split the difference. We're trying to figure out what the best political place to land is. That's a reasonable argument. That's not at all the argument that anyone in the world of liberal constitutional interpretation, though, has been invested in for the last 40 or 50 years. And so that I think is an issue hanging over all of these debates, right? That liberals, including liberal journalists, are very unhappy that conservative justices who do legal interpretation the way liberal scholars have said it should be done, not reaching the outcomes that they want. It's what you now have on the court, and nobody's happy with it. But that unhappiness should cause, I think, some revisions in how liberals think about the court that are quite challenging to make, more challenging than maybe we're suggesting here.
Saying that sort of difference splitting is a kind of political way to do SCOTUS bypasses how writing opinions on the most narrow grounds possible is itself a judicial philosophy that, say, Justice Roberts subscribes to. His big concern in Dobbs was that he felt you could address the case specifically and clearly without revising broad constitutional precedent. You could decide it on narrower grounds, and neither side, neither the dissenters on the left nor Alito and company on the right, thought that was cool. They wanted a big definitive decision. So I think that there is a judicial case, not a political case, for deciding cases more narrowly, and that impulse is not purely a kind of, let's just find a mushy middle. There's a judicial philosophy behind it that, unfortunately, Justice Roberts felt all alone on.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get hot and cold. All right, we're going to end the show with something a little more personal. Every week, we want to leave you, the listener, with a special takeaway. Something one of us is hot for or cold on, or, somewhere on the temperature spectrum in between. So who's feeling hot cold this week?
So I'm going to try and show the flexibility of this conceit by talking about something I'm going from hot to cold on, which is the empire around the TV show Yellowstone and its creator, Taylor Sheridan. One of the things we've promised ourselves is that we're going to do a fair amount of pop culture on this podcast. And Yellowstone, as the biggest TV show in America, subject of great political discussion and debate, is sort of an obvious thing to talk about. But I think that we're at the point where you can see the show and the empire around it going downhill. The big news right now is that Kevin Costner is not returning, and so the sort of current iteration of the show is possibly going to be handed over to Matthew McConaughey. But then there's also stories about the ridiculous budgets surrounding Taylor Sheridan, who created not only this show, but its various spin-offs. He's sort of single-handedly dominating Paramount's streaming service. But the baseline here is that we watched the last season of Yellowstone and both 1883 and 1923, which were the sort of Sheridan spin-offs in the last few months. And relative to the first few seasons of Yellowstone itself, they were all big disappointments. They made me think Sheridan is stretched way too thin and needs some kind of career crisis in order to step back and start making good television again. So I'm going from hot to cold on the Yellowstone Imperium.
Oh, yeah, I'm right there with you. I quit watching it in the last season because it had just gotten sad and weak, and I cannot abide any of the spinoffs. I'm sorry.
The great thing is I don't have to watch this now.
That's right. It's over. It's over before you even had to become aware of it.
Yes, thank God.
I'm right there with you, Carlos. Never seen a single episode. Glad I can skip it.
It's brilliant in the early episodes. It's better than Succession. Just
Well,
saying.
Succession hasn't finished yet, so, there's still time to pass a complete judgment there, too.
We'll see how they stick the landing.
Alrighty, on that note, we're going to ride off into the sunset. See you all next week.
Happy trails.
No. Ross.
No! That was gold. It was genius.
Ross always takes things too
got
far.
that one
No, do it,
far.
do it. That works. Okay, Michelle, write us off again.
All right, and on that note, we're all going to ride off into the sunset. See you all next week.
Happy trails, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Yippee-ki-yay.
Giddy up.
That got weird fast. Thank you for joining our conversation. If you liked it, be sure to follow us on your favorite listening app. Now, if you loved it, go ahead and give us a review and tell everyone you respect, or really can even barely tolerate, to give Matter of Opinion a try. Matter of Opinion is produced by Phoebe Lett. Mixing by Pat McCusker. Music by Carol Saburo, Isaac Jones, and Pat McCusker. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser. Special thanks to Alison Bruzak, Jeffrey Miranda, Derek Arthur, Stephanie Joyce, Allison Benedict, and Katie Kingsbury.